I want to introduce to you now Allie Donnelly, who is the Senior Manager of Post-Secondary Services at Easter Seals. What Allie is going to talk with us about today is transition services. Youth with disabilities in our school systems are protected under federal legislation called IDEA. And under IDEA, they're covered until the day before their 22nd birthday. When we lay that next to statistics such as 30 to 80% of youth in the juvenile justice system have disabilities, we can see that if we can find ways, if we can use resources that are already in place to help families and kids and communities get resources that are not just going to keep the kids out of the system, but develop pathways to give them lives of hope and real meaning, I think we need to mobilize around those resources. So Allie is going to speak to us about that particular resource now. And I just want to tell you a few more things about Allie. She is the former Director of Access and Opportunities for the Office of Diverse Learner Supports and Services at CPS. And before that, she was the department's transition manager. She's also worked with ISPE as a behavioral therapist, transition coach, and special ed teacher. So we're very happy to have Allie Donnelly joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you. Is that the clicker up there? Is that the clicker right up there? Yes. Okay, perfect. Good morning. I'm just going to grab the clicker, but if you don't mind, once a teacher, always a teacher, so I also can't stand still when I talk. So I'm probably going to move around the room just a little bit. First of all, thanks for the invitation to be here. Thanks to Heather and Nancy. I know that it seems odd that I'm with Easter Seals now. I actually currently run 3 non-public schools for children with autism and severe disabilities, along with 2 programs for adults who have similar needs, and a microenterprise employment program that employs youth with autism. Formerly, when I was at Chicago Public Schools, part of my responsibility was to oversee the delivery of transition services for the approximately 22,000 youth with disabilities in the Chicago Public School system. And so I want to focus today on how we can deliver those services to youth with disabilities, no matter the educational environment they may be in. First, a little getting to speak each other's languages type of approach. IDEA requires FAPE in the LRE. Can you raise your hand if that statement makes sense to you? Okay. So that's what we're going to talk about. A little bit of legal context. IDEA is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It is the federal law that governs the provision of special education services for children, youth, and young adults with disabilities in the United States. It is a federally mandated law. There is an educational right to these services for youth with disabilities in the United States. And then there is subsequent state law that can define even more intensive requirements for providing educational services to youth. So there are 6 major tenets of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Got to switch hands here. And that's where FAPE and the LRE comes in. FAPE stands for a free and appropriate public education. We are required to provide access to a free and appropriate public education for a youth with a disability, who is identified as having a disability, based on 13 specific eligibility categories. That education, that's a zero reject policy. We cannot not provide an appropriate education to an individual who's been identified as having a disability, no matter the disability and no matter how severe the disability. That education is driven by a full and individualized evaluation, meaning we make sure that it's culturally responsive, that the language of the family and the individual is taken into consideration, that that kind of evaluation is not based only on one test. When an individual is determined to be eligible for services because they do have a disability, the service provision is driven through the development of an individualized education program. It is in the least restrictive environment to the maximum extent appropriate, and we consider full participation by students and families to be essential to this process. Within the law, there are also built-in procedural safeguards, protections for the individual and his or her family, the rights that they have as part of this process and as part of the team that decides what services are needed and need to be delivered to that person. FAPE in the LRE. You with me? Okay. Here's a handy-dandy little chart. One of the things that you heard me mention was that these services have to be provided in the least restrictive environment. This is a really key component of federal special education law. And as we sit today and we talk about youth who may be involved in the juvenile justice system, we know that many of the environments that these youth may be in are certainly not the least restrictive environment. In fact, they may be one of the most restrictive environments. That said, they are still entitled to services no matter what environment they are currently in. So, to explain this little graph, or chart, LRE, the concept of least restrictive environment, is a continuum. So it's guided by that arrow across the top. And over on the left, you'll find typical services provided to all students in any school. Your classroom, your educational your classmates, your teacher in the classroom. And if you are a student who is participating in the general education setting, your LRE 1, you spend 20% or less of your time outside of a regular classroom. All of your services are delivered to you in your regular 2nd, 12th, 10th, 8th grade classroom, just like anybody else. But there are students who require more specialized supports, and sometimes those specialized supports they're delivered through a specialty program. And so as you move along the continuum of needing more intensive supports, there's a possibility that you are not participating in the general education classroom as much as your peers would be. You are being pulled out for special education services, or you are going to a special program for children with a specific type of disability. As much as possible, we want to avoid removing an individual with a disability from access to the general education environment. And there's a substantial amount of research out there that supports that there is no greater indicator of post-school success for a child with a disability than participation in a general education classroom. However, there are children and youth who need a more specialized approach, a more specific approach. I have students who have significant needs due to autism, who are very impacted by their disability and require highly structured, specialized approaches that we are able to provide for them. Our goal is to help each and every student that might be at my school reintegrate back into the school to which they would typically go to, where their brothers and sisters are. On the most significant and restrictive end of the LRE continuum, we've got separate schools, therapeutic day schools, alternative and residential schools, education at home, education in a hospital, and education in a correctional facility. These are the environments that are considered to be the most restrictive, where your access to general education peers is severely restricted. You are primarily educated with children who also have disabilities, or you just physically are not accessing those classrooms at all. For some of these children, education in that environment might be medically necessary. For some of these individuals, education in a more restrictive environment might be driven by the impact of their disability, and in the case of youth with disabilities who are in the juvenile justice system, it may be because of factors that got them there and into that particular setting. Moving on from my graph. Okay. I want to focus on the individualized education program because it's a really key part of service delivery. The IEP, as it's commonly referred to and called, it's the cornerstone of what services we provide to a youth with a disability. It's completely individualized to that student's learning. It's updated annually based on the student's progress. It legally protects the rights of students, and it includes provisions for transition planning and services. And the transition planning and services is the really critical part, because transition services for a youth with a disability can extend beyond the traditional senior year or 12th grade of high school. A student with a disability has the educational and legal right to receive special education services up until the day before his or her 22nd birthday. What was that? Did someone ask a question? Okay. So I'll repeat that because I think it's really important. A student with a disability has the educational and legal right to receive special education services until the day before his or her 22nd birthday, should the IEP team determine that that is necessary. And the student is absolutely part of his or her own IEP team. This provision includes youth with disabilities who may be incarcerated in alternative education programs or on some other less traditional path to school completion. Now, I want to, there are provisions of IDEA that I put some notes in here on. So a student is not entitled to FAPE, a free and appropriate public education, if he or she is between 18 and that day before the 22nd birthday, 21.364. If he or she is incarcerated and if immediately before going to jail or prison the student was not identified as eligible for special education and did not have an IEP. So if the youth was identified as having a disability prior to that juncture, then those services need to continue, and that student is entitled to receive transition services per the law. So what does it mean to provide transition services? I'll describe to you what the law says, but then I also want to talk about what we know works about service delivery. So transition services, in the state of Illinois, we are more restrictive than federal special education law. So IDEA, the federal law, mandates that no later than the first IEP to be in effect when the student turns 16, that we begin to plan for and provide these services. In Illinois, the age is 14 and a half. We provide more transition services for a longer period of time in the United States, or in Illinois, compared to other states. And that is state defined per special education, per state education regulations. When we provide transition services, we are expected to develop post-secondary goals based on age-appropriate transition assessments that account for training, education, employment, and where appropriate, actually I should strike that out, Illinois revised the law. It's now not even where appropriate, it's we're also mandated to account for independent living skills. Education, training, employment, and independent living services to that individual with a disability. The transition services also need to include a course of study that helps the student achieve the post-secondary goals that they are setting. There's a note at the bottom that transition services requirements may not be applicable to youth who may age out, may hit that 22-year-old cusp prior to being released from prison based on their sentence and their eligibility for early release. I don't want to focus on that. I want to focus on what the services should look like to any youth. So transition services are intended to be results-oriented. You'll see, I underlined some of the language in this slide. Results-oriented, facilitating movement. Transition is a process. It is not a one-time event. And the provision of these services has to happen in a sequential and building manner over time. It's not something we do once and we say, hey, we gave them some transition services, so they should be good to go. It's about that handheld movement to make sure that we're building a ladder towards the outcomes we want to see. It's intended to include post-secondary education. It's intended to include vocational education, integrated employment, continuing education into adulthood, adult services and linkages to those service systems that support an individual in adulthood, independent living, and community participation. Above all else, the intent of transition services is that they are completely person-centered and driven by the individual's preferences, desires, skills, aptitudes. And these are the big domains that we focus on. It's required that we consider and provide services across each of these domains. So what's the current landscape? Back in 2010, the Chicago Community Trust published a white paper called A Quest for Equality, A Quest for Equality. I encourage you to read it if you haven't. You can download a copy on the website of the Chicago Community Trust. And they looked specifically at Illinois and the gap that exists in Illinois for youth with disabilities compared to youth without. And found that students with disabilities in Illinois are far less prepared than their general education peers. 45% achievement gap between students with disabilities compared to those without. And based on their sampling data, 76% of the youth with IEPs, for the data they looked at, did not have IEPs that met the specific requirements of the law. Department of Labor. When we look at youth with disabilities, particularly ages 20 to 24, there's a substantially lower rate of participation in the labor force, and the unemployment rate is double than that of individuals without disabilities. And I went on the ODEP the ODEP website to look up January 2015 statistics. And you can see the differences here in terms of labor force participation for people with disabilities and the unemployment rate for people with disabilities compared to people without disabilities. So a youth with a disability has a substantially more difficult path to achieving the same outcomes than their gen ed peers who are exiting school and moving into the labor force. And that gets complicated when it's youth with disabilities who may be involved in the juvenile justice system in some way. In July 2012, the Government Accountability Office published a study citing they looked at what are some of the barriers, what are some of the transition concerns for this particular population of youth. Lack of access to we live in Chicago, so little less of a problem here, but lack of access to reliable transportation to even participate in the labor force or in higher education in particular. Lack of program access for certain groups of individuals with disabilities, inaccurate information, high schools not working on transition plans until it's far too late. Low expectations from parents, if parents are involved in that process at all for specific youth, and disagreement over who pays for services, and lack of interagency coordination. Transition is supposed to facilitate a seamless handoff for youth, and it doesn't happen the way that it's supposed to happen, and that no wrong door approach is something that we really need to be focusing on, because when you move from the school system where everything's under one umbrella to the adult system where there's 47 different front doors you have to go to try to get the services you need, that's where we find youth fall off. And that's where we talk about the transition cliff, is that all of a sudden the bureaucracy is overwhelming, and you have to have the will to get through it to try to advocate for the services you need, and the ability to advocate for those services. So that was a little depressing. I want to talk about what works though, and what we know at least, so that we can start thinking about how to deliver services. Nstack is the National Secondary Transition the National Secondary Transition Technical Assistance Center. They are funded by the Office of Special Education Programs in the U.S. Department of Education, and they are sort of the heart of like dissemination of research around practices that work for education of youth with disabilities. They've done a rigorous examination of the correlational research and identified 17 different predictors of in-school predictors of post-school success for youth with disabilities. So these 17 things have been shown that if we do them while a student is still getting education services from a school district, they do have an impact on the outcomes for that individual in education, employment, and independent living. So I know this might be hard to read, especially if you're farther in the back, but career awareness, occupational coursework, paid employment and work experience, you can see over here on the left, it lists what the predictor or outcome is. Is this okay, here's a predictor and outcome. Education, employment, independent living. And you can see that some of these predict success across all three of those areas. These are really key to look at. Paid employment and work experience while still in high school is a predictor of post-school success in all three of those areas of life for a youth with a disability. Inclusion in general education, which I mentioned earlier, is down there on the bottom. Self-advocacy and self-determination, instruction in self-care and independent living skills, being part of a transition program that delivers services in a specialized way, all impact the outcomes for youth. So things that we know based on these studies. Students with disabilities who participate in career awareness, have voc ed, have work study programs, have paid employment. We see more post-school employment engagement than for youth who haven't had a chance to participate in these kinds of programs. And the youth specifically who work for pay during high school are more likely to live independently after graduation as well. All of these slides, and I think that they are potentially being disseminated electronically, but they have links in them, and so if you click on those links, it takes you to where that information is housed so that you can find it. Oop. Over here, Nstack. If I were to sleep with my laptop open and have a website next to me, it would be Nstack. I love the information that they provide and disseminate. I use it all the time because it guides my practice. But Nstack and the National Post-School Outcome Center together have also identified the evidence-based practices that align with those predictors of post-school success. So not just if we do this, there are better outcomes, but how do we do this to produce better outcomes? How do we teach? What teaching methodologies have the evidence base to help us get to the outcomes we want to see? And so this is the alignment of evidence-based practices and predictors of post-school success. So if you want to teach banking skills, the evidence-based practices are to use community-based instruction, simulations, and a constant time delay procedure as your teaching methodologies to be able to do that. And when you go to these websites and you take a look at this information, they actually have links on there that you can click on that evidence-based practice, and it tells you for what population of youth with disabilities is this practice shown to work for. Does it work for youth with an emotional behavioral disorder, youth with a learning disability, youth with an intellectual disability, or autism? And one of the biggest predictors, and a piece that I really want to highlight here, is the evidence around building self-determination skills in youth with disabilities. I skipped one. Acting as the primary causal agent in one's life and making choices and decisions regarding one's quality of life, free from undue external influence or interference. Ooh, that's really hard. Making decisions about one's own life without those interfering elements. That is a very hard thing to do. Knowing that what happens in my life is based on my choices. It's not everybody else's fault when things happen to me. I know plenty of people in my own life who have not yet gotten there in the way that they approach life on a day-to-day basis. And for youth and adolescents, this is exceptionally difficult. Choice-making, problem-solving, decision-making, goal-setting, self-regulation, self-advocacy, self-awareness, and self-efficacy. Understanding that your own actions have an impact and you are the causal agent in your life. These are all components of building self-determination skills in an individual. But there's an emphasis on self-determination because what we know based on the research is that youth who have really low rates of school completion and adult success are youth with the lowest levels of self-determination. Young people with disabilities who have higher levels of self-determination are more likely to obtain post-school employment and live independently. And there's emerging research that shows us that there is a relationship between self-determination and what we consider to be positive school experiences, higher grades, higher attendance, fewer behavior problems. We can and need to be approaching assessment of self-determination and instruction in these skills, no matter the education environment for a youth with a disability. There are an incredible number of free resources out there that can be used, and access to resources is often one of the biggest barriers we have of trying to get services out there and implemented. There are free downloadable self-determination assessments on the Zero Center's website. These are all links in the PowerPoint, but the Zero Center, Z-A-R-R-O-W at the University of Oklahoma, has these assessments posted. They include components that allow you to have other important people in that person's life fill out components of this assessment to assess self-determination, whether or not the individual is able to participate. We always encourage that that person does, but if for some reason they're not able to, you can include information from other people in that person's life. And then there are free downloadable resources for teaching these skills, curricular resources that can be applied in any educational environment. So the good news is that there's things out there that we can use to provide the education components and have that sort of rehabilitative lens as we look at all these environments that a youth might participate in. And then finally, it's what can we do? Like, what should we do to promote change? Don't wait, act. I tell this to families all the time. When youth change from a school system to an adult system, entitlement turns to eligibility. If a youth has a disability and they are involved in the juvenile justice system, their right to transition services between the ages of 18 and 22 is an essential opportunity that we need to capitalize on, because it allows us this window to provide services that they are entitled to have in a variety of ways. And when we have that cutoff from the school system, whoops, you're done. You don't get to access those services anymore. If a youth turns 18 and exits school, graduates, drops out, accepts a diploma, you're cut off from those services. But if a youth has an IEP and transition services can be delivered in that 18 to 22-year-old window, we should be considering the youth's need for those services and figuring out how to deliver as much as we can in whatever environment that they are in. We need to advocate that that happens. We need to embed those transition services into all of those various systems. And I can't overemphasize the importance of linkages to other types of services. The vocational rehabilitation system being one of the primary access points that we should be using to provide youth with the support that they need to access post-secondary employment, competitive, independent, sustainable employment as they grow older. What I didn't put on here, and I should have, is the education component of educating those who interact with youth on the needs of a person with a disability and how their particular disability may impact them, so that we understand and we promote a culture of responsiveness, disability awareness and responsiveness, even within the juvenile justice system. There are a lot of invisible disabilities that impact a person and the way that they might respond or behave in a particular circumstance or environment. And at times, those particular behaviors can be interpreted as exceptionally negative or resistive and lead to more and more issues, when instead we need to take a step back and understand that due to the nature of this person's disability, there are certain needs that they might have, and we have to respond to those needs. So any person who may interact with a youth with a disability in anywhere on that trajectory that might end up with a youth in the juvenile justice system, we need a culture of disability awareness and responsiveness to be built, and we can all be a part of that, of building that awareness and understanding. So there have been a lot of recent conversations and coverage on this topic. I put some links in here. In particular, in December, there was a Dear Colleague letter published on the educational needs of students with disabilities in correctional facilities. Whoops, I keep hitting the wrong button, guys. There's been some media coverage. There was a HuffPost article recently on White House guidelines for education of incarcerated youth with disabilities. And of course, the Department of Education, Correctional Education and Juvenile Justice Facilities, and FAPE, there it is again, FAPE for eligible youth who are incarcerated and maybe in adult prisons in the United States. And then the last slide is just a bunch of resources that you or the youth may need to access or go to in order to get more information. I think I had a 5-minute time, and I'm pretty close. So if you have any questions, I also have my contact information up here for you. Thank you. Can I take questions, timing?
Just need you to come to the mic.
Hi.
Hi. Great presentation. I'm
Thanks.
Jim Harris-Gaddis. I'm Director of Child Advocacy at Lurie Children's Hospital. We're a hospital that provides specialty care for youth, primarily with disabilities. We're dealing with the consequences of our success. Many of these children died in childhood. 20 years later, they are surviving 90% are surviving into adulthood. So the whole issue of transition is very significant for us as well. And we have also, in terms of transitioning into adult care and gaining mastery of both their disorder for that transition, as well as life skills, are very much a part of our work. And for 18 years, we've actually worked in partnership with Chicago Public Schools and other school districts. I just want to amplify the importance of the healthcare institution as a partner, both in education and legal management and attention to youth with disabilities, because we are all overlapping. We now have an 8-week sales program supporting adolescents with independent life skills. There are other children's hospitals, Cincinnati, Boston, CHOP, Children's Hospital Philadelphia, that are addressing this. We also work with JVS, formerly Jewish Vocational Services, in a great partnership. And we have begun a program to provide paid internship opportunities for youth within our hospital. because they're receiving care there. We'd like to introduce them to careers in healthcare. We actually have had some success in finding full-time employment with us, but JVS in other settings. So it's not exactly a question, but it's just a note of encouragement.
An emphasis of importance.
Yes,
yes.
thank you.
And I appreciate that, you're right. Access to those transition programs, particularly the job training and education and readiness, are so critical. And we see lots of interagency partnerships that are becoming more and more successful within this context. Thank you.
I just had a quick question about youth who are in the justice system, who are unable to obtain an IEP. How do you know what services they would need? How do you determine that without having the resource of an IEP?
So youth who are in the juvenile justice system that you may suspect have a disability but are not currently accessing those services, that they don't have an IEP. So school districts are obligated, there is a concept called child find. Have you ever heard of it? Okay, so I heard some nods, I saw some nods. Child find is an emphasis that school districts are not just supposed to let students with disabilities kind of happen to appear. We have an obligation to go out and find children with disabilities who need services, identify them as eligible or not eligible, and then provide those services. So if there is a youth who is in the juvenile justice system and is suspected of having disabilities, a disability, you can submit a referral to their school district for a full and individualized evaluation to determine if they're eligible for services, and if they are, an IEP will be developed for them. So it is primarily driven by the home district, the school district that child would attend, based on where they live. And through that district, there are specific sites or places that you refer to. But typically, if you just go to that district's homepage or website, or you call them and you say, I know I have a youth that needs to be referred, they can guide you from there. 18, so then the follow-up question is 18 to 21-year-olds. If the law gets a little bit more specific around identification of youth who are between 18 and 21, depending on where they are, if they are in the juvenile justice system, depending on the environment that they're in, and if they've been identified before 18. So typically identified before 18, have an IEP, right to transition services continues on. If they are after the age of 18 and have not yet been identified and are incarcerated or in a correctional facility, FAPE does not apply in those situations. Did I answer your question? Okay. Any other questions? The lunch bug is out there, I could tell. Okay, thank you.